Paul Johnson from the Institute of Fiscal Studies is here now. Talk about the scale of ambition here that John McDonnell set out for a future Labour government.
Well, I think there's no getting away from the idea that this is not really about just getting rid of austerity or moving back to where the last Labour government was. This is a root and branch change to the way that the economy has worked since at least the 1970s. This is very big scale nationalisation, a very high minimum wage, lots of controls on the way that things happen in the labour market, and you heard promise after promise for things that they will be spending on. So completely consistent with what was in the manifesto, we're looking at a state, a government, much, much bigger than anything we've experienced in a generation or two.
Right, and in terms of paying for it, Labour always claimed that they had a fully costed manifesto. You queried those costs, as we talked about before. But in this speech, there wasn't, as far as I could tell, very much about how they would pay for all of this.
There was a single line in the entire speech about paying for all of these ambitions, and that line says, we will close the tax loopholes and avoidance scams used by the mega rich and make sure the rich and giant corporations pay their way. Now, you cannot pay for the huge expansion of state activity that Mr. McDonnell was describing there simply in that way. Now, let's be clear, you can pay for it, you can have the state doing significantly more than it does at the moment, you can bring things into public ownership, but you have to pay for it. You can't pay for it just through tax loopholes. This government has put through 100 pieces of legislation, more than 100, to reduce tax loopholes, has got £10 billion from it. There are not tens and tens and tens of billion pounds lying on the floor ready for a new government to scoop up.
Right, you say there isn't the money there, sort of low-hanging fruit or even perhaps high-hanging fruit to pay for these big pledges. But what about the promise to increase corporation tax or reverse the cuts and to raise taxes on higher earners, those earning over £80,000? I mean, he's going to need to get a lot of money from those people to fund what he set out today.
He is, and that's, I mean, he didn't actually make those pledges explicit in what he said today. All he talked about was the tax loopholes, the mega rich and big corporations. But yes, in the manifesto there were big increases in corporation tax, which would raise significant sums of money, though not as much as was hoped. There were big tax increases on people earning over about £85,000 a year, and again that will could raise significant money from people earning the £80,000, £100,000, £150,000 a year kinds of levels. But we know that for the really rich, the people on very big sums, it's much harder to get the money from them.
Right, let's briefly talk about the private finance initiative before we talk to one of Labour's front benches in the Treasury team about this speech, because he was lauded, if you like, for when he stood up and said, we aren't going to sign any more PFI deals, as they're known. We're going to look to bring them back in. What did he mean, do you think?
Well, a private finance initiative is essentially where the government pays a private company to build a hospital or a school or actually a government department, and often to run them for a period. But because they're paying them year by year, they're not having a big impact on the deficit at the point at which the hospital is built. And actually it was Gordon Brown who was the biggest user of this, more so than Conservative or coalition governments. Now, the problem is some of these were very badly written contracts, some of them have been rather overpaid for. The issue then is, how do you legally bring them back into the public sector, given that there are legally enforceable contracts, however badly written, between government and private sector? Are you going to expropriate them, or are you going to pay an awful lot up front to get out of them?
Stay with us, Paul Johnson. Just to recap, we're chewing over John McDonnell's speech to Labour conference.